Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming back on the last day. I know it's a little difficult after all these conversations and long 2 days, but thank you so much for making it to our morning session bright and early. We've been having some amazing conversations over the last 2 days, and I would hope that in this session, which is the keynote speech by Maya Ziswiler, and the next 2 sessions, we will continue doing that. I just want to remind you to fill out evaluation forms. You will find those on your seats, so just fill that out and turn it back to the registration desk. We would really appreciate your feedback on the event. So today we have Maya Ziswiler as our keynote speaker. She's the Program Director for Education and Early Childhood Development at UBS Optimus Foundation in Switzerland. Maya is also the head for Social and Financial Innovation at UBS Optimus Foundation and has spearheaded the foundation's pioneering work on the first development impact bond in education in India. Ms. Ziswiler has also advocated for importance of innovation and integration of early childhood development, a topic that we've been discussing a lot over here. Before joining the foundation, Ms. Ziswiler worked, among others, at the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, Tuberculosis, and Malaria, usually known as the Global Fund within the education sector. And she was responsible for PPP at UNICEF. So she has a very rich experience in both the development industry and the financial industry. And I hope we will be able to ask her a lot of questions and understand that world a little better. So Maya, I'll get you on here.
Thank you very much, Arushi, and thank you very much to the NORRAG team and the organizing partners for giving me the opportunity to really share Optimus Foundation's experience with innovative financing in education. So today what I would like to do is I'd start to describe really the continuum of funding from giving to investing and really go into a little bit deeper the innovative financing component that I'll be focusing on throughout this presentation. I'd like then to turn to some of the opportunities and challenges in the innovative financing sector in education. And finally, I would like to go through a little bit more detailed case studies of focusing on some of the Optimus Foundation's experience in this field. So if we look at the continuum, the way that we describe it, we've separated out into 2 main buckets initially. So thinking about philanthropy on the one side and investing on the other. Optimus Foundation is active in the first 3 areas of philanthropy: charitable giving, strategic philanthropy, and social finance. Maybe what's helpful for you to understand is a little bit how the Optimus Foundation is structured, is that we are funded, our core funding comes from UBS, the bank, but our programmatic funding comes from our clients. So one of our work is to try and engage clients in that journey from charitable giving to strategic philanthropy, and then leverage some of the expertise of the bank to start thinking about the added value of financing to bring new capital to the development sector. What I will not do in this presentation is talk about the sustainable investing space, where the way that we think about it is that sustainable investing is really focused on market-based financial returns first as a priority. In the social finance space, what we look at is social outcomes first, so maximizing social outcomes first, with the potential for a financial return. So just thought that it's helpful to clarify that what I will and will not be touching upon throughout this presentation. Another way that we think about our work in the social finance sector is thinking about it along 2 dimensions. One is the scale, and the other one is the social versus financial return. Traditionally, philanthropy has really been a way to put seed risky funding into initiatives to test their viability, and then more philanthropy money to try and get them to transition to scale. Once it gets to a larger scale, that's when we feel like philanthropy should step out, and that's the role of the government or a bilateral, multilateral funder. What we see as social finance is, as an option, a different pathway to scale, where we're able to attract new capital from private investors to look at that transition to scale. And these new investors are willing to take on risks that government or bilaterals and multilaterals are not willing to take. Once we reach scale, there are now two options available to us. If it's a for-profit model, you will be able to transition it to a more sustainable investing commercial investment. Or if it's a non-profit model, you still then are able to transition that scaling piece to governments or bilaterals and multilaterals. Touching upon what I mentioned in my previous slide, again, the social finance space is about impact first, so financial returns based on social outcomes, versus the sustainable investing is basically financial returns, market-based financial returns first, with the possibility to also have an impact component. That's how we make the distinction. Why does it make sense for an organization like Optimus to be involved in this space? The foundation has been alive since 1999. We've been in the philanthropic space for a long time. Contrary to what some of people in this room might think, there are some advantages to being associated with a large Swiss bank, and that is obviously access to the expertise of a global financial institution, access to some of the world's wealthiest clients, and we know that 90% of those are actually philanthropically active. And we have experience being the investor in the first development impact bond in education, which is why actually in the past 2 years we've moved from being solely philanthropically focused with grant making to really tapping into this new area of social finance. So, and I think Arushi has definitely touched upon this on the first day, thinking about why does innovative financing make sense in education. I think the first is really thinking about resource mobilization. And we know that there is a gap to be filled in order to reach Sustainable Development Goal number 4, and the current funding through foreign aid and traditional philanthropy only adds up to billions rather than the trillions that are actually needed. So there is a need for new sources of funding in order to be able to bridge that gap. And we feel that philanthropy can play a catalytic role in trying to close that gap by really bringing together the financial sectors and the development sectors. The other point that I'd like to mention is really the opportunity to improve the effectiveness and equity of educational spending by bringing in a transparency and access to information and accountability that is focused on outcomes. And this is some of the elements that can be brought in through the private sector. What innovative financing has done really well, for example, for the health sector, is that it's been able to raise the profile of the sector and therefore attract new sources of funding. So I think innovative financing also has that role in trying to make the case for investing in education and raising its profile. The other element is also about promoting innovation in education. So being able to attract new type of risk capital that encourages new implementation models, that encourages new innovative financing instruments to be tested. That being said, there are still quite a lot of challenges when we think about leveraging innovative financing in education. One is thinking about the time frame for investment. So usually investors are interested in a shorter time frame where they're able to see their returns come in after 1, 2, 3, maximum 4 years. And that can be a challenge in the education sector, though I think there's an opportunity there to focus on certain types of interventions and certain types of outcomes where there is the possibility of seeing those returns occur in that shorter time frame. The other thing that you're all very well aware of is that, the education system has a complex value chain. There's a strong interdependency between different parts of the education system. So that makes the complexity sometimes difficult to be simplified in terms that can be understood by investors. The other element, and I'm sure we'll touch upon this later through the presentation, is really the measurement piece. And we know there are quite a few disagreements amongst even education experts around what types of measurements should be used to measure whether an education intervention is successful. So there's that complexity, and again, there's the need for simplicity on the investor side to be able for them to understand. And the other thing that is more of a a controversial, dogmatic kind of discussion is the fact that government remain the main funders of education and providers of education. Therefore, philosophically, should the education sector be off limits for investors? And I know we've had some debate over the past few days around the role of the private sector and philanthropy in the education space. But that is certainly a topic that keeps coming up, and that certainly has not been such an issue in other sectors such as health. So the involvement of private sector, the involvement of the privatization of the health sector is not been as controversial as it is in the education space. I'd like to focus the rest of my presentation around the different elements that we see as part of our innovative finance, social finance work within the Optimus Foundation. The first part is really that we feel like as a philanthropy and as a foundation, it's important for us to build the ecosystem for innovative financing. And that is early grant support to be able to attract private capital. And then I'll go into a few very concrete examples of instruments that we've tested as pilots and that we're now in the process of seeing how we can transition to scale. So one is a debt instrument that is really looking at how do you support promising social enterprises with a revenue model. And the other piece is really development impact bonds and looking at really that concrete case study where payments are linked to social outcomes and results, and where you can also bring in a non-profit model because the payments are linked to those social outcomes and not to the actual financials. And lastly, I'll just touch upon what are some of the challenges and the debate that is going on right now around how do you move from these pilots where there's been several of those pilots to a really a scalable option. And we certainly don't have a final answer to that, and I don't think the actual space has an answer to that. But there's certainly quite a lot of questions and elements of responses that I would like to share with you and get your thoughts on as well. So in terms of building the ecosystem, what do we mean by that? We feel that our flexible patient grant capital can be very useful in reducing upfront transaction costs and reducing uncertainty so that then investors can come in at that second stage. We provide support to build local capacity via technical assistance. We try to enable sharing of market knowledges and best practices. We try to support the building of evidence to be able to shape policy and regulatory reform. And we also support intermediary and accelerator organizations to build the space. I now want to dig a little bit deeper into a very concrete example. And I've not chosen this example because I feel like it's a perfect example. I've chosen this example because I know that it's a topic that's been brought up a few times over the past few days, and I think it's a controversial one. So I thought on a Friday morning it's good to get people's juices flowing. But jokes aside, I do think that public-private partnerships lend themselves very well to a transition into innovative financing, and I think there's a lot of lessons that we have learned from the Liberian pilot. So just want to put that into context. I think it's a learning opportunity, and it's one where I want to be able to highlight the role that philanthropy has had. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Partnership Schools for Liberia, it's a form of public-private partnership where non-state school operators have taken over management of certain public schools. In the first year, it was 93 schools. In the second year, we're looking at about 200 schools. But the teachers remain on government payroll, and the schools remain accountable to the government for their performance. And I just want to quote the Minister of Education of Liberia, Minister Werner, who said, and these are his words, not mine, the education system is failing Liberian children, and we need to try something radically different and new in order to be able to find a way to improve the education for the children in Liberia. Again, his words, not mine. I think that was one of the reasons why Philanthropy got involved, is because there was also a very strong support from the government at the Minister of Education level and even at the presidential level. One thing I think that's worth noting is, yes, it's the first kind of partnership of this kind in the world. What a number of philanthropists came in to do is to be able to actually bring in multiple operators to this pilot, rather than the one operator that was initially going to be the only one involved in a pilot. So I think a number of philanthropists supported that involvement of several operators, both non-profit and for-profit. And that certainly was important to a number of us. What Philanthropy also did is brought in an external independent evaluation to try and look at the program, to be able to improve it going forward, but also to be able to have that critical distance to it. And the other thing that the Philanthropy did is capacity building with funding for the education delivery unit within the Liberian Ministry of Education. So maybe to just give you an example of where Partnership Schools for Liberia has been a catalyst for change within the school system as a whole. The operators that were involved, one of the promises was that they would get public school teachers on and paid by government. What they realized is that in some cases, even though these government teachers were supposed to be on payroll and present, there were a lot of ghost teachers. They appeared to be on payroll, but actually never came to school and taught. And as part of that effort, and as part of that feedback to government, the government really launched an effort to try and eliminate ghost teachers throughout the entire Liberian school system. The aim of the Partnership Schools for Liberia is to be able also to transition to a more results-based model where providers are financially accountable for delivering that quality. I think what it also triggered is a broader discussion about aid effectiveness in the education sector in Liberia that I think has been difficult, but also I think very welcome. And I won't go through this in detail, but just to highlight some of the results from the external evaluation that's been done by Center for Global Development and Innovation for Poverty Action, looking at the students' literacy and numeracy improved compared to non-partnership schools for Liberia. Attendance is improved. Teachers are more likely to be engaged. The students' attitude has also improved. And while extra resources are important, the changes in management practices play a very important role. That comes with a big but. I think it's a fair criticism from some other stakeholders, is that we're not comparing apples to apples, because the resources used in PSL schools are higher, in some cases much higher than those that have been used in public schools. And specifically one operator, which I won't mention, didn't have to apply to the same rules, introduced classroom caps, had a high teacher turnover, acting more in its own interest rather than in the common interest. So certainly lessons learned from this initial pilot, and I think in year 2, the focus has been really to try and have one contract, one MOU that applies to all operators, have a stronger governance structure for decision-making with the education delivery unit in the lead of that governance structure, and to monitor costs for all operators so that if it doesn't fit within a certain range, it's probably not suitable for a PSL-type program going forward. just wanted to show you the kind of the vision and how this fits within the innovative financing, my innovative financing presentation. The idea was for philanthropic donors to be involved in year one in that pilot to provide support for operators that aren't yet reaching scale and need that extra support up front, and then to transition it into a results-based funding model when there's more scale reached and get funding, the large funding agencies in Liberia to pick up those costs and pay only if the results are delivered. Obviously, the long-term vision is for the Liberian government to be able to take that on, but given the current funding situation in Liberia, that's unlikely to happen in the short term. A couple of more examples of building the ecosystem, and I think I'll go through that quickly because I wanted to get into a little bit more detail on the actual instruments, but funding of best practices and networks. So, for example, the Global Schools Forums that has been co-funded by a number of philanthropic organizations like ARC, the Omidyar Network, ourselves, to try and get these network of non-state operators to be able to focus on quality and equity and providing the access to the expertise and experts to access to a set of measurement tools that enable them to be able to focus on that. The other example that I'll mention is Innovation Edge, which is also a consortium of funders that have put money into this to fund innovations in the early childhood development space in South Africa. And it started off as a purely grant-making facility, funding innovations like leveraging space in the supermarket to be able to communicate, parents to be able to communicate with their children about things that happen in daily life, to, for example, funding an app where teachers in preschools can test whether children have hearing problems and then make referrals to health clinics on that basis, or using blockchain technology to be able to register early childhood development centers and then trigger a subsidy from the government. So a wide range of innovations in the early childhood development space, and that's now transitioned into a mechanism that not only can provide grant funding, but can provide blended finance opportunities, everything from grants to debt to equity, depending on the organization's needs. Moving on to some of the more concrete instruments in innovative financing and focusing on results-based finance. The way that the model works is that, and I'm giving the example of Optimus Foundation in this case, is that investors provide working capital, and those investors, in our case, are ultra high net worth or high net worth clients of the bank that channel their money through the Optimus Foundation. That money is then provided to a service provider to maximize social impact, and then there's a possibility to get a return and potentially recycle their capital to generate a results-based return. So two examples that I'll give are, one is what we call loans for impact, and two is really looking at the development impact bond model. The loan for impact model is really designed to be able to provide debt funding to promising social enterprises and targeting beneficiaries in low-income settings that can pay for some products and services. And the aim is really to be able to reconcile the tensions between financial requirements of investors on the one hand and the impact motivations of social entrepreneurs. Often what tends to happen is that social entrepreneurs, when they get funding from investors, they're not able to focus on the social impact anymore because they really have to focus only on providing that financial return for their investors, and that means having to compromise on the social impact. It means targeting a higher segment of the population, and the aim of such a loan for impact is to be able to reconcile those tensions. So an investor like ourselves would provide a loan to a social enterprise and the social enterprise can then reimburse that loan based on the product that they're selling. But in addition, what they're able to get from a third party is an additional payment if they reach impact. So maybe if I show you this chart, it helps explain it a little bit more. This example is one that is a little bit outside of the education space, though it is about providing clean water in schools, but this is a real pilot that we're currently testing, and I think this illustration shows nicely how we can compromise between the requirements of investors and the requirements of the social enterprise. So if you look at the line that's going downwards, the more impact that the social enterprise has, the less return they have to pay back to the investor. So they're incentivized to have more impact because that means that they have to pay less money back to the investor. If you look at the other line that's going upwards, the return for the investor increases the more impact that the social enterprise delivers. So there's also an incentive for the investor to make sure that the social enterprise has an impact. And that delta that you see there is being covered by an outcome payer. In our particular example, that outcome payer is the Rockefeller Foundation. Moving on to development impact bonds. So first of all, development impact bonds are not bonds, just to be very, very clear. They're results-based contracts in which working capital is provided upfront by investors. Outcome funders, usually donors or governments, only pay if results are achieved. Some of the benefits of a DIB structure is that it creates a certain transparency and accountability. The risk, and I would say the financial risk, is transferred to investors. And the reason I say financial risk is because the reputational risk is very much on the service provider side as well. Because it's so open and transparent, if they don't deliver on the results, they risk getting funding, both, jeopardizing their funding both on the grant side, but also potentially on the development impact bond side. So the reputational risk is certainly also on the service provider side, and it provides flexibility and innovation in the program execution. So by providing money upfront that is linked to results, it means that the service provider can decide to change their activities and adapt them in order to maximize the outcomes. So they're not anymore bound by X number of teachers that have to be trained or X number of staff that needs to be deployed. So that provides that flexibility. To show how that actually works in a schematic, the investor provides the working capital, as you see, number 1, to the service provider, which then delivers the program, number 2, to its beneficiaries. That program is then evaluated by an independent outcome evaluator. Based on that evaluation, the outcome payer pays the money back to the investor. The other thing the last part of it is the incentive payment. So if the service provider over-delivers on its targets, it also gets the possibility of getting for lack of a better word, a bonus payment. So there's also an incentive for the service provider to not only deliver targets, but over-deliver. Development impact bonds are a great tool in certain circumstances, but they're not a silver bullet, so they don't work in all cases. So what I try to show up here is in cases where development impact bonds make sense, and cases where development impact bonds probably don't make sense. So they work well if there's a clear outcome, if there's an ability for innovation, if there's a need for external capital, and if new collaborations or partnership are needed. What's really important is for the outcomes to be measurable and simple. And that comes back to what I said earlier during this presentation, is the need for simplicity on the investor side, which can be sometimes quite complex, which also means that this doesn't work for all sectors. And certainly within the education sectors, it does not work for all types of interventions. It's important to be able to, it's important for it to be a government and a donor priority. Because if that is not the case, then it will simply not work. And to counter that, obviously, the areas where it doesn't work as well is when there's limited opportunity for innovation and where it's difficult to attribute impact to the intervention rather than external factors. Our organization is in the process of bringing development impact bonds to scale. We started off with a very small pilot with Educate Girls, and I'll show a video about the Educate Girls DIB, so to give you a little bit more color to what we do. And then we're looking at transitioning to scale with a larger education DIB that I'll go into a little bit more detail after I show you the video, and then some ideas around scale in a fund type structure.
If you want to reach your true potential, education is the one piece that will help open doors. I decided to set up Educate Girls, and it's a non-profit to work in critical gender gap areas where the problems of the girl child in terms of education are the worst.
We have several problems in the development sector. Number one is that not enough money is flowing to the critical issues. And number two, there's organizations out there implementing programs who are very good at raising money, but not as good at achieving outcomes. We have the Sustainable Development Goals, which aim to bring people out of poverty by 2030. And right now we have funding gaps that are trillions of dollars every single year. So traditional funding is not going to meet the SDGs on its own. Development impact bonds are an impact investing vehicle that focuses first and foremost on impact and outcomes, yet delivers an incredibly favorable return.
So the Development Impact Bond was one mechanism with which we could tackle these challenges. It's never been done before in the education sector, and especially in the developing world.
So this is the first Development Impact Bond, and we funded it as a pilot. We're in the proof of concept stage. We're testing this, and it's been very successful.
The Development Impact Bond is a 3-year transaction, and it goes across 166 schools, serving 18,000 children, about 9,000 girls. Educate Girls is the service provider, and we deliver the outcomes, taking out of school girls, bringing them back into the school system, and improving learning outcomes.
UBS Optimus Foundation is the investor, putting up the working capital so that Educate Girls can do what it does best.
So they give us the money up front, and they bear the risk of performance.
In this case, the outcome payer is the Children's Investment Fund Foundation, and they take no risk.
So we will reimburse the costs of the investment that UBS Optimus makes when they deliver the kinds of outcomes that we agreed and we contracted for. So for Educate Girls, this is a huge opportunity to get new funding to enable them to go to scale beyond what's possible with traditional development funders. One of the other amazing opportunities from this DIB is that it brings new investors into the development marketplace. They're able to invest in social impact and get the returns that they were expecting to get perhaps from traditional market investments.
For the first time in my career, I see an opportunity that encourage the sector to fundamentally change and to bring more and better money to solve some of the biggest global challenges that we're facing.
So I thought it would be nicer to show you a video that also brings us back to why we actually create such sophisticated models to try and bring new money to the sector. I wanted to comment on two things that we've seen in this video. One is the comment by Robin Horn from SIF saying that it allows investors to basically diversify their portfolio by investing in a vehicle that is not based on the capital market. So they're able to therefore have a return that is linked to social outcomes. On the one hand, it fulfills their need to be able to really have a social return in addition to financial return, but even from a financial return perspective, it allows them to diversify within their portfolio so that they're not putting all their eggs in one basket, relying on the capital market. The other thing that I just wanted to highlight is that we're now in the year 3 of 3 of this pilot. The initial results have been positive in terms of the enrollment targets have been exceeded. We're, let's say, on track to deliver on the learning outcomes piece. But what is probably even more of a success story in our mind is that it's been very positive for the service provider. And to quote Educate Girls' CEO, she said that it really led to a shift in the organization's DNA, and it had a positive effect throughout the entire organization. And Educate Girls is a very traditional non-profit NGO. So for those who are very critical of these types of model, this has been a positive story for an organization that didn't have any kind of link to financial markets, to for-profit. It's a very traditional non-for-profit NGO that works in some of the most remote areas in Rajasthan. I just wanted to briefly touch upon the next iteration of a DIB that we're developing. So moving from this initial pilot that was relatively small, where we invested $300,000 to thinking about what does a transition to scale mean and how does it make sense for these types of instruments to be developed. One of the criticisms that we've received on the pilot is that transaction costs are very high, the time spent, the resources are tremendous, and at the end of the day, it's relatively small. So the answer to that is yes, it was a pilot. The intent was to test the feasibility of the instrument and to see whether it worked. Would we continue doing small pilots like that? No. The idea is how do we transition that to scale so that it makes sense from a cost effectiveness perspective. So that transition to scale attempt is with this new education DIB that we're building in India, where we have now several outcome funders on board and several service providers on board. It's a fund that is a 10 million fund, so substantially larger than the one that we developed initially. And I think what was important to us is to also bring in local philanthropists and local players on the funder side, but also we were able to secure the support of a bilateral organization such as DFID. That also means that thinking about the transition to getting a government funder on board is more likely. And we also obviously have very strong MOUs in place with the state governments where we're going to be working. The objective of this DIB is really to increase financial flows to these high-quality programs, to deliver improvements in learning, and to try and create a systemic change within the Indian education system. So as I mentioned, it's a 10 million outcome funding pot. It's going to be a 4-year program. We've currently shortlisted 4 service providers, so Educate Girls, building on the experience that we've had with them so far, as well as 3 other service providers that we selected based on quite a rigorous selection process, looking at are they able to operate at national scale? Do they have good relationships with governments? Do they have a track record of being able to deliver education outcomes? So that's just to give you a sense of how we selected those service providers that are now a part of this payment, a part of this structure, sorry. Similarly, as what I explained earlier, we will have an outcome evaluator that looks at whether those learning outcomes are achieved, and if their outcomes are achieved, then the outcome payers would pay the investors back. So a little bit more about the intervention models. The idea was really to test several types of interventions that have a track record of being able to deliver learning outcomes, to look at which types of interventions might be more effective and cost-effective in delivering those outcomes. And this is just to show a little bit of the vision of the fund to try and influence the education system in the longer term to help students catch up to an age-appropriate learning level. Which is why we chose a little bit of a longer period, looking at a 4-year period, and we aim to able to build up a track record of effective interventions and have a targeted advocacy with governments to able to get them to look at interventions that are successful and maybe only pay for the results of interventions that are successful in the longer term. So to conclude, I just wanted to leave you with a few thoughts on the pathway to scale and some of the obstacles that we're currently facing in trying to undertake these DIB programs. As I mentioned, so there are high transaction costs, and it's quite complex to negotiate these individual deals. As you can imagine, trying to put together a structure where you're cooperating with a development agency like DFID on the one side, foundations that are based in India, the US, and the UK, as well as an investor that brings together high net worth individuals from around the world takes some time and is not so straightforward. The other thing that I think is one that is a fundamental issue that we've had so far with these pilots is a lack of coordination between supply and demand. So on the one hand, what we've struggled with is trying to secure outcome funding and understanding what donors are willing to pay for, which outcomes, at what cost, and what's the total amount. And therefore, how do we match that with the right type of supply of projects that meet those requirements? We've also struggled with very different levels of knowledge amongst the different stakeholders. So to give an example, the bilateral organizations are set up mostly to be able to deliver grants, and their whole budgeting cycle is based on yearly budget approvals. How do you transform that into something where they're able to commit upfront for a 4-year program? So there's a lot of change in mindset, in all the contractual requirements, in the types of expertise of the people that get involved. That has been certainly a challenge. The other thing that I think is very important is that these DIBs allow, the small pilot DIBs have allowed financing to occur for individual projects. So small and specific targeted projects rather than focusing on organization or system-wide change. So thinking about how you can set up a broader fund structure where you're supporting a number of organizations towards a broader goal is certainly a requirement or a vision for DIBs going forward. Maybe this is my last slide, and just to conclude that the rationale for being able to scale this is to move away from this short project-by-project approach to be able to focus on outcomes rather than inputs, regardless of final impact, to be able to lower the transaction costs that, as I mentioned, were very high, to be able to match that supply and demand by pooling funding, so getting a number of outcome funders to come together and say, we are willing to fund certain outcomes in education. This is the amount that we want to put into it, and therefore we can, on the investor side, supply the right types of projects to match that. And the other thing is to improve overall cash flow efficiency. And I haven't gone into this in this presentation, but by putting together a fund structure, you're able to reuse capital throughout the duration of the project to make it more efficient. Our kind of next step in trying to thinking about scale is a conference that we're co-organizing with the Swiss SECO and the Swiss Development Corporation in partnership with the Inter-American Development Bank to start going into a little bit more details around what are the barriers to scale and how can we bring together a number of stakeholders on one side on the outcome funding side and on the other side on the investment side. Thank you very much. Any questions from the audience?
Thank you very much. You've answered a lot of questions that I had about the. I'm here about the DIBs. I know Safina very well,
yeah.
So it's I know the growing pains and this, and sometimes she'd say to me, oh my God, is it worth it? The amount of work we're putting into it for a very small amount of money.
Right.
And what she did say was that it made them relook at their monitoring and evaluation framework, etc. One of the things that I find is slightly incoherent is, for me, the fact that you say that this offers flexibility and innovation, while at the same time the demands of reaching certain targets are very fixed. So how can you make those statements? Because I know of other DIBs, because people are talking about them a lot now in the health sector. And again, the need for simplicity, for me, takes away from the need for flexibility and nuance in terms of the monitoring and evaluation framework.
No, I think that's a very good question.
And one comment, because you said you're the first group that have had a private for the Liberian partnerships. In fact, the International Baccalaureate Organization have been working over a number of years with the Ecuadorian Ministry of Education to help them to reboot their educational system for very similar reasons with Liberia, because it was in a very dire strait. So they approached the IBO, which is a not-for-profit foundation, who have been working very closely with them to reboot and help with teacher training and so on. So I just wanted to say there are other examples, slightly different, but it has been happening.
No, I think that's a fair comment, and there are certainly other PPPs in the education space. The collaborative schools in South Africa, there's a PPP in Pakistan that's ongoing. What I meant is the first of this type and of this kind of, let's say, quite dramatic shift where really the whole management of the schools are being taken over by non-state operators. But absolutely there are other
because they're working in 200 schools in the Ecuadorian public system. So
okay, thank you. In terms of your comment around the mismatch between, on the one hand, flexibility and innovation and then a set of very strict targets, I think what we've found is that comparing to traditional grant making, certainly from a lot of the bilaterals and a number of the foundations that are very much focused on a clear set of outputs, that a DIB allows flexibility of course, within the period of time, to think about how to recalibrate the work that they do in order to reach those targets. So what, for example, Sofina has shared with us is that they realized that the children weren't really improving in English. And they realized that it's because the teachers themselves were not comfortable with teaching English. And so they then revamped their training and provided also more kind of reassurance and self-confidence to teachers about their ability to teach English. The other thing that they did is really look at which schools were performing well and which staff were assigned to which schools, so that they then basically reshuffled their staff based on how well they did in different schools. That's something that they had never done before, and that they probably wouldn't have thought of doing, because it was just about how many schools do we need to reach, how many staff do we need to train, and therefore not thinking about how well are the staff doing in compared to the school's performance. So in that sense, I think it does bring some more flexibility. Yes.
Thanks. That's been fascinating. I have two questions. One, just in relation to DIBS, is there any impact on the content of education that arises from that particular process of financing schools? And secondly, to take you back to your apples and oranges comparison of the PSL, one of the recent critiques of this suggested that PSL was able to take advantage of 5 changes, policy changes, things like increased school hours, lower class size, a more focused curriculum, in some cases better paid teachers. And if those policy changes were implemented in government schools which were not privately managed, you would then be able to compare apples with apples, more or less, if this critique is correct. Is there any effort to try and do something like that so you can actually get around to comparing apples with apples?
I think, yeah, thank you. So I think to respond to your second question first, the idea is, yes, to be able to test this in a kind of pilot setting with a focused number of schools, and then to be able to trickle it down to the education system as a whole. That we're not there yet. I think the idea is that in this second year, we would still focus on 200 schools that are managed by non-state operators. And I think one of the arguments is that the set of schools, that the management style that has been implemented is one that has really had a significant effect on the changes that you see in schools, and to try and be able to maybe leverage some of the benefits of those different types of management structures and bring those back into the public school system as a whole. To give a concrete example, in Liberia, there's the government works through county education officers and district education officers. And as part of the process of working with those non-state operators, it's also led the government to rethink what are the roles and responsibilities of these CEOs and DEOs. How can we improve their ability to monitor performance of the schools? What maybe training is missing? What types of incentive systems are in place? So I think it does trickle down to more than just the schools that are being targeted through this pilot to a larger system. But I think your point is very fair, of thinking how beyond these initial few years, how would that trickle down also to the entire school system in Liberia. On your first question, and correct me if I misunderstood this, you're asking, does a financing mechanism like a DIB have impact on educational outcomes? Was that your question?
Educational content.
Content.
Not necessarily the mechanism, but the actors involved in that mechanism. Do they bring a philosophical, ideological position to educational content?
Well, so I think in terms of influence, there's certainly the service providers that are being chosen that certainly have their own philosophy in terms of what kinds of education content they provide, on the one hand. On the other hand, you have the outcome payers who determine which outcomes they're willing to pay for. So in that sense, they have that kind of level of influence. So to take the Educate Girls example, the outcome funder was very keen on learning outcomes, literacy and numeracy. But what we were able to negotiate and come to an agreement with is that it also made sense to include enrollment of girls, one, because it's at the core of Educate Girls' theory of change, but also that it brings that equity component, because it encourages Educate Girls to focus on enrolling the most marginalized. In this part of Rajasthan, we're talking about girls.
Thank you so much. That was... I learned so much, and it was very interesting to see all the thought that goes into those tips. So it was really wonderful to listen. 2 questions. One of them, the colleague just addressed. I was wondering, 10 years down the road, because it's a 3-year, is the idea that this is a pilot project, and that what happens after 3 years? Like this idea of spilling over to other schools and scaling up. Is there any thought at all, like in a systematic way, to use that as innovation? Or is that not the goal? That's the first.
Go ahead.
The second one is, and that's the critique in the US for these kind of models, and also for charter schools, but also internationally. How does such a project avoid bringing in cost effectiveness criteria? How can you prevent that schools or providers do not negatively select the students that get enrolled? Like not take children from disadvantaged areas or with learning difficulties because there is so much pressure to perform. This is one of the big criticism of those that, criticize privatization of education, that there are so many ways of leaving out children that would need it, but because there's this pressure to perform.
Thank you. That's a great question. So on the first question, and specifically on the Educate Girls DIB, Safina and the team and the larger team they're in discussions with the Chief Minister of Rajasthan and the Rajasthani government for them to potentially come in as an outcome payer in the next stage, so that they would contribute towards Educate Girls model in the public schools, because it's shown that it has improved learning outcomes over these few years. So thanks to this proof of concept, we were able to show that an organization like Educate Girls that brings in actually, in terms of resources, a quite small amount of additional money compared to the total money that the government is already spending on education, and actually has a dramatic improvement in terms of the outcomes. So I can't say that we have a final commitment, but I can say that we have had very solid discussions with the government of Rajasthan in order for them to take on a role, a financial support role going forward. That's on the first question. The second question was the pressure to perform, and one of the ways that we've tried to tackle that in a DIB structure is 2 ways. One is that we measure relative performance rather than absolute performance, so that you reward not for reaching a certain benchmark, but that you're rewarded on the ability to get a student from a very low level to a slightly higher level. That's one thing. And in order to do that, we make sure that there's solid baselines in place initially to make sure that children aren't selected based on ability, so that there's a level of control at the beginning of the program to try and avoid that.
So I want to thank you for a very clear and thoughtful presentation. My name is Kate Lapham. I'm from the Open Society Foundations. And I wanted to follow the question that Geeta had just asked about incentives for pushing out or excluding children who may not be progressing as quickly, because I think it's incredibly important for this model, particularly if you're working in places where there are large numbers of out-of-school children, and as the model progresses, the access targets will approach 100%, right? So that you want to have all of the children in school in environments where actually the Ministry of Health might not be aware how many children are in each age cohort, because not everyone might have a birth certificate. If you are measuring learning outcomes, even in a relative basis, only on literacy and numeracy, and you're not expanding to include more complex cognitive measures, you're not looking at social emotional development, you're not looking at the benefits of diversity or citizenship or those sorts of formative experiences in the classroom, you won't be capturing the benefits of having children who are different, of having children with special education needs in the room, and the incentives to exclude those children in some way, even if they're initially enrolled, will remain very strong. And so I would like to hear what are the thoughts about dealing with these as the program progresses. But I also have a financial question. I also respect that this might be far too early in the process for you to be able to answer this, but perhaps the health sector provides some information. So in the Educate Girls project, you estimated an internal rate of return of 10% by the end of 2018. And so, clearly there's a profit margin that needs to exist for the investors to take on the risk that the government or the aid agency or whoever is paying the outcome targets is mitigating. And I'm wondering if you can talk about how that risk premium relates to what the cost would have been had the government or the aid agency simply invested in services across the board. Right? So are they actually protecting themselves from risk across the board and shifting that to private investors, or are they paying a higher premium than they would have had they simply worked to provide universal education?
Thank you. Thank you for your very thoughtful questions. I'll start with the second one first. So the answer is, in a developed country context, so looking at the social impact bonds that are out there, there are analysis that have been able to look at how much is the government saving by investing in a SIB structure versus if they were to invest alone without a SIB structure. And the SIB model is really based on that cost-saving opportunity. In a developing country context where those costs aren't always, unfortunately, fully available, and the level of data is not always transparent, the answer is we don't have that kind of analysis. That being said, we're also at a very early stage in the process, and the aim is to be able to get to a point where we're able to look at that cost-saving angle as well. The argument right now is to say that government might not have invested in these types of interventions that have more impact, and therefore, and the other argument is also that they're able to, as an outcome payer, be very hands-off, so they don't have to worry about the monitoring the implementation, and they only pay if results are achieved. So if results aren't achieved, they don't pay anything. Whereas if there are certain results, they pay proportionate to the results that were achieved. That was your second question. The first question was around including more a number of different measures and benefits of education, including social emotional development, cognitive development, etc., making sure that you don't exclude children with disabilities. And I think that's an absolutely fair point. And I think one of the things that we say is that DIBs don't work for all types of interventions, and that in order to be able to include private investors and get the benefit of additional private capital to be involved, there is a certain trade-off to be made on the simplification side. That being said, I think that if you think about specifically the Educate Girls context that is very rural Rajasthan, looking at an improvement in literacy and numeracy is already quite a significant improvement versus the status quo. On making sure that we don't exclude anybody, again, that has to do with the measurement process and making sure that as of baseline we're aware of how many, in the case of Educate Girls, we did a door-to-door survey to look at which children are out of school, which girls are out of school, and every year that door-to-door survey is done again, and so there's no way to hide anybody throughout the process. It's very clear that those girls, whether they're enrolled or not, is very transparent throughout that process. I hope that gives you partial answers to your questions.
Thank you very much. Very interesting, very clear presentation. I also had two questions, one of which you've addressed in some ways and relates to the last two responses. That they're both framed by the idea that these models of practice and intervention are drawn from practices in the global north, and the emphasis here is on the positive learning from those models. There seems less attention to the negative learning from the northern models. What I'm thinking of in terms of the first issue and has been addressed is that if you look at results-based programs in the public sector, in the global north, in education, health, transport, they're awash with gaming. That there are many and multiple sophisticated gaming techniques involved in results achievement, together with sometimes closely related perverse incentives. And if we had time, I could run through. I like to collect examples of these, and some of them are very funny, and some of them are very grim. But you didn't give. You alluded at various points to some of these in your comments, but it wasn't seen as an issue or a barrier that needed to be addressed at the end. But you've addressed that to some extent. The other one was I'm fascinated always by this fixation with scale. Because again, if you look at the global north, in education, probably arguably the two best examples of innovation to scale would be the English Academies program and the American Charter Schools program. And in both cases, arguably, you could conclude that there's an inverse relationship between scale and effectiveness. That for the most part, most of the providers are unable to manage growth and scale. And there comes a point where there are actually negative relationships between scale and effectiveness. But none of that thinking seems to enter into the fixation with scale in development programs in the global south. I just wondered what you thought.
Thank you. So on the second question, first the obsession with scale. We are not advocating for scaling particular organizations up to a point where they do not become efficient. The idea of a DIB fund, for example, is to be able to involve a number of service providers to be able to reach that scale. So that we can leverage an increased amount of funding and therefore reduce transaction costs. So just to be clear that in terms of scale, we're not advocating for scale of one particular model of one particular organization.
Although that would be the same for the charter school and academies. It's the introduction of more providers, although the providers are also growing themselves. But the model seems to be the more providers you have and the more you allow each of the providers to grow to scale, the more ineffective the whole system becomes. That would be, I think, the conclusion one would draw from those two examples.
I'm not sure I agree with you, but that's fine. We can agree to disagree. And remind me your first question, sorry.
It was about the role of gaming. I mean, you've addressed it to some
and
extent.
I think that's an absolutely fair point, and that's absolutely an obstacle that we need to address. And you're right, I didn't put it up on the screen, but it's certainly one that is very present and that we need to think about as we're developing the verification and the outcome evaluating system. So that's an absolutely fair point, and it should have been up there. So thank you. Yeah.
We have one question online, and I'm going to say this will be the last question for this session because we're completely over time right now. Would you agree that grantors and grantees operate at an equal level in these partnerships, or is the agenda leaning one way or the other?
The grantor and the grantee. So who is the grantor in this case? Is the grantor the investor, or is the grantor the outcome payer? I mean, in terms of power relationship, if we want to call it that, the investor provides money in most cases completely upfront. So that means that the grantee has quite a lot of flexibility to operate how it wants. How is that different between the power relationship of an NGO that gets money from a large development agency or a philanthropist? They're also, I would argue actually that in a more traditional grant making setting, the power relationship is probably even more disproportionate.
I'm sorry, we'll have to close this session now just so that you can have at least a short break. Please don't forget to fill out the evaluation sheets. If it was not on the chair you're sitting at, it's going to be on the chair next to you, and return that to the registration desk. Thank you. We'll see you back in the parallel sessions.